I posted a story of mine a couple weeks ago or so. Not going to write it up again, but to give the gist of it, I was doing body recovery on contract for the police, found a body and attached a line and started swimming to the surface when something grabbed the body and started dragging it at incredible speed. I cut the line just in time to prevent myself from being yanked down with it. I'm sure some of you deep-sea loving Enans will remember it. I've got a couple other stories of my own that I can go into more depth if you guys want. Mostly stuff involving fish that were a bit too big for comfort coming to take a look while I was doing some welding, or that time my rebreather malfunctioned and I started having a full-blown drug trip while I was 200 meters underwater. Fun stuff. I've got a ton of more interesting stories though, mostly from other divers. I can't speak to the truth of them because I wasn't there. Some are pretty out there. Keep in mind, some of these stories are sort of like diver urban legends, they get passed around until nobody can remember where they got started. The story I'm about to tell you though, I heard from a good friend of mine, a dive master and the guy who trained me on my first dives. I have no reason to believe he's lying. This was back sometime in the late 80s I believe. My friend, let's call him Frank, had just gotten out of the Navy and started doing civilian work. Mostly welding, and he worked with the police for a short time like I did. Like me for Frank, diving was both a hobby and a job. So he would spend his weekends exploring known shipwrecks and points of interest known to the local diving community. Sometimes he would just set anchor in a random spot and dive down to see what he could find. He usually found a whole lot of nothing, but on this particular occasion he hit the jackpot. Metaphorically speaking, because there was nothing good about what he found. He was doing an extreme depth dive that day, which as I explained in my last post. I'm not going to name the lake he was diving in just in case it somehow leads back to him. But it was a very large lake that was 900 plus feet deep. So he was pushing the boundaries a bit, especially since he was solo diving without any partners. He gets to the bottom, and as per usual there's just the usual sand, silt and some rocks covered with algae. Not even any fish that he could see. He digs around in the sand a bit to see if he can find anything, and he feels something hard and smooth buried a few inches under the surface. Frank grabs it, and tries to take a look at it a bit further up away from the floating sand. It was some sort of prescription bottle with the label worn/torn off. So he puts it off to the side and keeps digging, finds something much bigger right away. He pulls it out of the sand, and to his shock he's staring at a human skull. He digs around in the sand some more to find the bones, pretty much feeling his way around because the fine sediments he was digging up made his visibility zero. He found something else hard and pulled it out, but it wasn't another bone. It was another skull. He kept digging and found on his estimate at least 200, likely more skeletal remains at the bottom. Mixed in with the skeletons were, he estimated, thousands upon thousands of prescription bottles like the one he found earlier. He didn't have enough oxygen/time to stay down for long, so he dug around in a few spots to see how large the dump of bodies and bottles was. He estimated it must have been almost 50 by 50 feet roughly in size. So it's possible that there could have been many, many more bodies there than his estimate. Probably the spookiest bit is, since he had done work with the police he knew what a body looks like underwater at various stages of decomposition. The bones had been picked clean by the fish, but the bones themselves couldn't have been there for much longer than 5 years. Like a good citizen, Frank carried one of the skull pieces up with him to the surface. He talked to some of the people he'd worked in the police with as a diver, and they immediately told him that they were not going to investigate and that he should never speak about it again. Being someone who valued his own skin, Frank did just that, and ended up moving to the other side of the country about a year later. He never told me why, but I've got the feeling that he no longer felt safe working/living there. Okay, time for one of my own shorter stories. Frank has more interesting stories than me, but I want to share some stuff from my own personal experiences as well. This actually happened just last year. I was doing some maintenance/repair work on a dam for an artificial lake. I had chosen this spot to work in particular because it was a treasure trove for exploration as a diver. Since the lake was artificial, there were several small villages, farms and homes that had been submerged when it was constructed, something that's actually surprisingly common when it comes to artificial lakes. So I was down at the bottom of the dam, doing a visual inspection of the gate guides and seal plates, trying to find anything that needed maintenance or replacement. It was summer, so the water was pretty murky and visibility was low. Something shoved/nudged me on the back and I turned around expecting to see my dive partner, but instead I was starting right at the face of the biggest, ugliest catfish I've ever seen. Water does weird things to your perception of size, but I could swear this thing must have been the size of a small SUV. If it had wanted to, it could have eaten me no problem. I froze in place because I hadn't expected to be in danger from the aquatic wildlife on a freshwater dive, but he swam away and circled around for a while as I worked. It's actually fairly common, fish watching you while you work, but I've never seen one as big as this before. I'm just glad he wasn't hungry. This next story is a bit out there, so to speak. I trust Frank, but being deep underwater can do strange things to the human mind. Narcosis can and does cause hallucinations among other mental disruptions. I've experienced it myself firsthand. When it's happening, your brain can't distinguish reality from the hallucination, and there's never a point in your mind where you go, "Oh wow, I'm tripping." Because it's usually a case of the frog boiling where it comes on you slowly. Anyway, back to the story. This was probably late 90s to early 2000s? Frank wasn't really clear on the date when he told me the story. Frank at this point has graduated from casual wreck exploration to full-blown treasure hunting. He's got a boat with sonar designed to find shipwrecks and all sorts of neat stuff. To this day he hasn't found anything of actual value, but I suppose the thrill of the chase is a treasure of its own. It was the long weekend, so Frank was making a big expedition to a remote part of the coastline where an old ship apparently sunk in the early colonial period. Nobody ever found the wreck, their route was known, but there was a storm and they never arrived. The location was extremely remote. You either got there by boat, almost a 2-day trip from the nearest suitable launch, or you hiked there on foot. Frank figured that the remoteness of the area accounted for the wreck never being found, which is why he was so keen to search himself. He still talks to me about going back there today, since he now has a portable sonar system that you can mount on a canoe. He didn't have one of those back then, so he just packed a bunch of food and supplies for the weekend along with his diving gear. I doubt you could even carry a canoe with you on that hike, but if anyone could, it would be Frank. He gets to the ocean, sets up camp a ways away from the ocean in a sheltered nook, then drags his gear down the ocean and goes for a dive. First day he just snorkels mostly. Second day, after he has the lay of the land, his words, not mine, Frank decided to go diving. He only had 2 cylinders of air with him from the hike, so he had to make his time count if he wanted to find anything. The entire expedition was ill-advised in my opinion, but Frank does what Frank wants. Apparently he thought he knew exactly where that damn wreck was because he had figured out where the currents would be pulling any debris. So he sets out for that spot, swims in and dives. Frank gets to the bottom and to his disappointment, does not find a shipwreck or sunken treasure or anything really of interest. There's a lot of just various debris and shit, some pop cans, trash and garbage even. Just when he's about to give up, he hears the telltale sound of a boat motor coming from the surface. His immediate instinct is to surface and say hi, but his instincts were screaming something else. So he decided to wait and see until he ran out of oxygen and head to surface. He swims up a bit closer to the surface to see if he can find the boat, following the sound. He sees come in above him and cut off the engines. Something big gets tossed into the water and begins to sink like a rock. Frank said that it was immediately obvious to him what it was based on the silhouette, but he didn't really fully realize until the man sank past him, eyes bulging with shock, screaming with empty lungs. Frank followed him to the bottom as fast as he could. When he got there, the guy was still conscious, but just barely. He pulled off his rebreather and fitted over the guy's face while trying to free his legs. His legs had been put in buckets full cement. Frank alternated breaths on the rebreather for about 15 minutes while desperately trying to break the guy's feet out of the concrete, without any luck. The whole time he thought the guy was trying to talk to him, trying to say something that he couldn't understand. After about 15 minutes, Frank realized that he couldn't get his legs free. If he stayed down any longer, he would run out of air and die himself. He said leaving the guy down there to drown was the hardest damn thing he ever did. The poor bastard realized Frank was leaving and frantically grabbed him, trying to rip off his rebreather and keep it for himself. Frank ended up kicking him in the face and swimming off without looking back. He reported it to the police and they found the body about a week later. It was a mob-related killing. Apparently it actually happens more often than you think. I don't think Frank ever got over what happened, the way he described it. First the pure relief and joy when Frank gave him rebreather, and the agonized, panicked fear when he realized Frank was leaving him. Being someone who dives for a living, I've had lots of friends who drowned on the job for various reasons. It's not something you really dwell on a lot, but this man has always stuck with me. What the hell was he thinking, in his final moments? It's probably due to my line of work, but I've got a bit of a fascination with death. Or rather, the final thoughts right before death. That last, final spark before everything gets snuffed out forever. I have more stories to tell you Enans, but I've got to go do real life shit now. So if this thread is still here later, I'll come and post some more. If not, I'll post them in the next deep sea thread that I come across. Thanks for all the kind words. Oh, that's the black carpet. Allegedly a bit of an urban legend amongst deep sea divers. I'm that diver anon if anyone was in the last deep sea thread. I've heard about this thing a couple times from co-workers and buddies. I don't remember the details of the full story right now to be honest, but I'll talk to my buddy sometime and see if he remembers and post them on here. But the basic gist that I can remember is that this thing is some sort of colony organism, like a giant moving coral. It's a giant black carpet of macrobiotic cells that crawls over the ocean floor, sifting those nutrients with millions of tiny fillers. Nobody has ever gotten a good estimate of the size other than it's big and apparently it makes a noise similar to this bloop thing. One guy apparently saw it swimming/riding the currents as well, so it does more than just crawl on the ocean floor. I suppose you could call it a one-of-a-kind organism, but I'm not sure if that applies to colony organisms like this.
Macrobiotic cells. So you're saying the ocean floor is covered by a giant jellyfish?
Essentially, yes. According to how the black carpet has been described to me, it shares many similarities to a jellyfish. One story I heard had a diver getting stung by some sort of large feeler strand that apparently hangs off the top, similar to a jellyfish. There was this really old retired diver I talked to who claimed to have seen it. He claimed to have seen an entire decomposing sperm whale being consumed by the carpet. I should really make a post compiling all the stories I've heard about this thing.
If it's similar to a jellyfish and is actually a colony of microorganisms, then it might be related to the Portuguese man-o'-war.
The way I've heard it described, it shares more similarities with a starfish or sea anemone than a jellyfish. The marine biologist guy who said he'd seen it had some interesting thoughts on what it was. His idea is that it's some sort of holdover/descendant from the very first invertebrate forms of life on Earth. He did a whole long talk about how coral is one of the oldest forms of life on the planet, and the reason why the ocean is the only place teeming with large invertebrate creatures is because that's where all life first evolved. In his mind, jellyfish and all other sea invertebrates probably evolved from this thing rather than vice versa. This giant sea carpet or whatever would have been one of those very first life forms to ever exist on Earth, technically making it one of our ancient ancestors. It's a pretty cool theory, all things considered. So I talked to my buddy and I'm going to start writing up some of the stories I've heard about the black carpet. This is the first story I heard of it, from some Finnish bloke with a strong accent. He was doing a deep sea dive repairing some sort of cable. I assume it was probably fiber optic. As he told it, initially he thought he was in the wrong spot because he couldn't find the cable anywhere. He starts searching and eventually finds one end, just the one. Sheared clean through. He gets his dive buddy to stay with that end of the line while he goes looking for the other end, swimming in a straight line in the direction of the other line. In his estimation, he swam about half a mile before he found the other end of the line. He stressed to me that the entire half-a-mile middle section of the line was just completely gone. It was a huge deal and everyone thought it was the Russians, but this guy was sure that this carpet thing had done it. Said he heard the noise it apparently makes, even thought he never saw it. This next story is from my buddy. He heard it from a guy who heard it from another guy who heard it from another guy, so take it with a heavy grain of salt. This guy is doing a dive. Depth, location, what he was doing never got specified. Just that he was really deep. He starts hearing this odd noise that gets associated with the carpet a lot. The way he described was similar to that video of the bloop. Ultra low pitch, sort of like a super creepy distorted whale song. As he gets closer he hears this almost static crackling noise as well. The way he described it was like a million prawns getting cracked open at once, if that makes any difference. As he gets closer to the bottom, the noises are getting louder and louder. At this point he was thinking that he's hearing some sort of sonar from a submarine and that some jackass submarine crew is playing a joke on him. When the guy gets to the bottom he shines his light around, trying to find whatever he's looking for. And what he was that the sea floor had literally come to life and was crawling past him. This is probably the best description of the carpet you're going to get. According to this guy, carpet is at least a mile long/wide. Made mostly of these strange black feelers that apparently make the strange popping noise. Most of the top is covered in various sand, rocks, debris, with feelers poking through. Also a few long transparent stalks as he described them that float upwards. Apparently some of these were like 20 feet long. According to the guy it was singing, which doesn't make any fucking sense to me, but whatever. Guy swam back up to the surface and claimed he had an equipment malfunction. Came back down a couple hours later and got there just in time to see the last of the thing disappear. Apparently it stretched as far as the eye could see. Which isn't that far at the bottom of the ocean, but still. This one is an old urban legend that's been floating around the diving community for years. Never heard a concrete source of it, so emo it probably never happened. Especially since it involves a submarine crew, so I'm not sure how a diver would have heard about it, since as far as I know submarine crews usually stay inside their ship. Anyway, here goes. Submarine is doing something, either war games or patrolling for Chinese/Russian/North Korean/bad guy submarines. The story isn't terribly consistent about this, I hear it different every single time. For whatever reason, they are not using active sonar because they want to avoid detection, floating dead somewhere a couple hundred meters off the sea floor. They're just sitting there, chilling and listening with their sensors trying to detect enemy submarines or whatever, when they start hearing the noise. Their sensors can't make any sense of it, and it's getting louder at an alarming rate. Starts out as something only the sensors can hear, but before long the entire crew is hearing this strange, distorted humming/singing that people always associate with the carpet. Captain thinks the only explanation is that it's some sort of new sonar/jamming technology and order the sonar crew to send out a ping to locate the source of the noise. This is the part of the story that stays the most consistent, I assume because it's the most memorable. The sonar operator shouts out new sonar contact, bearing. Sir? What's our depth? The captain replies, 500 meters or whatever depth the submarine is supposed to be at. The sonar operator replies. But sir, the sonar says the sea floor is 10 meters below us. The captain says that's nonsense, then walks over to the sonar station. Checks the reading, then walks over to the helmsman and checks the depth. Checks the nautical charts for where they are. Somehow apparently, the ocean has gotten about 200 meters shallower. The captain orders another ping from the sonar to try and locate the source of the noise. Sonar operator speaks up again, concerned. Sir, the ocean is getting deeper again. Captain asks him to repeat himself. Ocean floor is once again at expected depth, sir. Captain takes a look for himself and sure enough, they are no longer 10 meters above the ocean floor. There is also a very, very large dot on the screen behind the submarine. Captain asks what the large contact is. Sonar operator, equipment malfunction, sir. Captain pings again. Just out of curiosity. The equipment malfunction has maintained its shape and is continuing to move away from the submarine, and apparently taking the strange noise with it. Again, this is basically an old wives' tale amongst deep-sea divers, so take it with a grain of salt. It's possible that a submarine detected the carpet or whatever on sonar and that's the origin of the story, but I highly doubt this actually happened. Still makes for a cool story though. Last story for now, I'll see if I can dig up some more later. This is from the old guy I talked about earlier. Nice guy, marine biologist who has done both deep-sea wells and nature research/studies with ROFs. Apparently the carpet ate one of his ROFs on an expedition. According to him, it happened late one night while the rest of the crew was sleeping. He was pulling an all-nighter studying the sea life around volcanic vents. He's moving the ROF from one vent area to the next when he sees what he described as churning sediments on the sea floor, a giant moving cloud of underwater dust essentially moving towards the ROF. He moves in closer and sees what he describes as colossal echinoderm crawling along the sea floor, with long, dexterous filament probing the sea floor ahead of it. He maneuvers the ROF in for a closer look and uses the arm to prod one of the filaments. In the blink of an eye he lost contact with the ROF. Apparently it happened so fast he didn't even see it happen. 1 second the thing was about 5 meters away from the vehicle, the next second it had swallowed the thing whole. His excuse for not having footage was that the footage was all recorded and stored on the ROF rather than being recorded on the operating station, which seems fishy to me. He was, however, very confident in himself. To the extent he claims that he is the discoverer of this new species. He even gave it a name, which I completely forgot because it was so stupid and boring. Giant sea carpet sounds cooler anyway. Way back in the mid-1980s I read in a book on cryptids that there was something called the hide. Apparently it was a flattish thing with eyes along the rim, about the size of a large cowhide, hence the name. From what I recall the one observation was of such a creature rising up out of an underwater trench to absorb a shark who'd somehow become paralyzed by it. It was observed at some distance by a diver. Does any of that ring a bell to anyone? Supposedly took place somewhere off the Pacific coast of South America. I've heard some people who claim to have seen that thing or other similar things. A lot of stuff I've heard from other divers seems like they could be attributed to very rare/large siphonophores that live in the deep sea. What you're talking about was described to me as a sort of pancake-shaped creature that would hide under the sand with a single small near-transparent tentacle floating upwards. A diver touched it, spasmed, and immediately the creature rose out of the sand to devour him. Don't touch strange shit in the ocean, people. May as well go on a tangent and talk about some other stories I've heard that might be attributed to siphophores. There was this one cranky old retired diver who swore he'd seen a sea monster of unfathomable size on a dive once. I always assumed he was full of shit, but the way he described it sounds a lot like a siphonophore. The story went something like this: he was on a dive doing something that I've forgotten when he sees an absolutely giant tentacle stretching up from the nearby drop-off. The thing was so huge he couldn't see no beginning nor end to it, and so now he goes around constantly claiming to have come within a hairbreadth of devourment by a gargantuan sea leviathan of unfathomable proportion. And yes, that is exactly how he talked. Looking into these siphonophores, it makes total sense that something like this could exist, though it would be less of a sea monster than a giant serpentine jelly blob sifting through plankton and floating nutrients. Another siphonophore-related story I've heard is one about an absolutely gargantuan jellyfish-type creature that was allegedly about the size of a military submarine. The diver who saw it said the thing was so massive it had somehow developed its own biosphere with various species of fish circling around and swimming inside it. He described it as having an appearance like a giant